Have you ever thought about how many decisions you have to make on a daily basis? We make decisions all the time, don't we? What to eat, what we're going to wear, when we're going to go to bed. And while some of the decisions we make are simple, others are so much more complicated. They're the kinds of decisions that we have to make that might alter the course of our lives and affect the ones that we love. What would you consider to be the hardest decision that you have ever had to make? Think about that for a moment. What is the most difficult decision that you've ever had to make? Perhaps you decided to move out of state, away from family, away from your home to pursue a new career opportunity. Perhaps you had to make a choice about who to date or who to marry. That's certainly a major decision. Some of you have even had to be in the unfortunate position of deciding whether or not to continue medical treatment for a loved one who is dying, even including a beloved pet. When I ask that question to myself, what's the hardest decision I've had to make? I've had to make some hard choices in my life, but I really think the hardest choice that I've ever had to personally make is whether or not to have kids. And I know that might sound surprising to you now, as Chris and I have Sam and Eli and another baby on the way, but it's true. During the first few years of our marriage, Chris and I were just so unsure about parenthood. It felt so nice to be independent and not to worry about the responsibilities that come from raising another human being. At the same time, though, both of us had always had this innate desire to be parents, and we felt that our family would feel incomplete if we didn't have at least one child. So we wrestled with that a lot during the early years of our marriage. Now, it's obvious, as we look back on our past, what decision we decided to make. We decided to have kids, but the path to that decision wasn't easy. In fact, we only arrived to the conclusion that we arrived at based on a conversation that we had with another couple during lunch one day. This couple who helped us patiently weigh the pros and cons of all of our options. Their wisdom was like a light that broke through our fog of uncertainty and allowed us to be decisive about an issue that we had gone back and forth about for nearly 4 years. It's interesting to me that you and I are faced with decisions all the time, and yet we struggle to know what the right course of action is in so many of the circumstances we face in life. In my case, it was helpful to have other people come alongside of both Krista and myself to offer an outside perspective. But today I want to walk you through with the reality that so many of the choices that we make, the difficult decisions that we have to make, often don't have the benefit of that second opinion. And even more important than that, there are times when we have to make a difficult decision when it feels like God himself isn't responding to us, that it feels God himself is absent or silent, that we ask God for clarity about which decision we should make, and we arrive to the end of the day feeling like he hasn't told us which path we need to go down. I think a scenario like that for those of us who are Christians can feel confusing at best and absolutely paralyzing at worst. It can cause us to stumble in our faith and to struggle in our relationship and trust with God. As one writer says, God can be maddeningly hard to get. When God says that his way are not ours, he really means it. We have these encounters with him where he breaks into our lives with power and answers our prayers and wins our trust and waters the garden of our faith, making it lush and green. And then there are these seasons when chaos careens with apparent carelessness through our lives in the world, leaving us shattered. Or an unrelenting darkness descends, or an arid wind we don't even understand blows across our spiritual landscape, leaving the crust of our soul cracked and parched. And when we cry to God in our confused anguish, he just seems silent. He seems absent. Certainly, I am not the only person who has felt that way. I'm sure there have been seasons of life where so many of you have felt like that too. And I really think that's how David was feeling at the beginning of 1 Samuel 27. Let's talk about where we're at in the story of 1 Samuel so far. Last week, we saw how David spared Saul's life for a second time, not once, but twice. David and his army had snuck into Saul's camp during the night. David stood right next to Saul while he slept. Once again, Saul was as vulnerable as he could possibly be. We're told that there was a spear right next to Saul as he slept. David could have picked up that spear. He could have made the choice to pick up that spear and end everything right then and there. But instead, David made the choice to spare Saul, to show him mercy. And upon hearing what David had done, Saul publicly vowed that he would never harm David again. I mentioned last week that this is actually the last time that we see David and Saul interact. Give you some spoilers. Before long, Saul is going to die in battle. But apparently, David didn't believe that Saul would stay faithful to his vow, so he ended up seeking protection elsewhere. And today's passage picks up telling us what David did to seek protection. It tells us that he actually went to the Philistines, of all people, to be protected. So if you have a Bible and would like to follow along, as I said, we're going to be reading all of 1 Samuel 27 today. Hear the word of God. David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. So David set out and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to the king of Achish, son of Maach of Gath. David stayed with Achish at Gath, he and his troops, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's wife. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. And then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your sight, let a place be given to me in one of the country towns so that I may live there. For why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag had belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. The length of time that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and made raids on the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. For these were the landed settlements from Telam on the way to Shur and in the land of Egypt. David struck the land, leaving neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the clothing, and came back to Achish. When Achish said, against whom have you made the raid today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jeremites, or against the Negev of the Kenites. David left neither man nor woman alive to be brought back to Gath, thinking they may tell about us and say, David has done so and so. Such was his practice all the time he lived in the country of the Philistines. Achish turned to David, thinking he has made himself utterly abhorrent to his people Israel. Therefore, he shall always be my servant. You see, David was so worn out from the ongoing threat that Saul had posed to him that he decided to gather up his family and his army and move to the land of the Philistines. Think about that for just a moment. The Philistines. Throughout the past 27 weeks, we've talked a great deal about how the Philistines were in constant war with the people of Israel. David had even killed the Philistines' champion, Goliath. And yet, here in chapter 27, we're told that David decided to move to Goliath's hometown of all places, of Gath. Talk about irony, right? What's going on is that David had concluded that Gath would have provided him with sanctuary. It was maybe the one place in all of the ancient Near East that Saul would have refused to follow him to. And his assessment was actually correct. Verse 4 says, when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. One of the things I do during sermon preparation is I try my best to read or listen to at least 2 or 3 sermons based on the text that I'm preaching on. And this week, as I was doing that with this particular text, one of the things that I saw is so many of the sermons written about 1 Samuel 27 talk about that David's decision in this particular case was wrong, that David failed to trust God and relied instead on his own wisdom. And while I can see why a person would reach that conclusion, I actually think there's a bigger lesson to be learned from this story. That is to say, 1 Samuel 27 doesn't provide an assessment or offer a judgment as to whether or not David made the right decision in fleeing to the land of the Philistines to escape Saul. It simply indicates that he made what he thought was the right decision based on the faculties that God had given to him. I want you to consider for just a moment the context of what's going on, especially relationally, in 1 Samuel 27. Up to this point in the story, David had relied on other people to help him make decisions. Samuel, Jonathan, even God himself. But here, in the events of chapter 27, David was apparently all alone. Samuel was dead. Jonathan was nowhere to be found, and God was seemingly absent. One of the things that we learn in biblical interpretation classes is that if God seems absent in a text when he's kind of expected to show up, then we might pay attention to what the author is trying to communicate to us theologically about what is going on. And so with that in mind, I think it's so significant that God isn't referred to at all in this passage. Not by his generic name, nor by his personal name. Up to this point, David has continually consulted with God, seeking his will whenever he's had to make a choice, but now it feels as though God isn't there. Here's how one commentator susses all of this out. He says, the absence of overt reference to God's direction or guidance seems appropriate in a passage devoted to describing the way that David negotiated his way through tricky circumstances without the obvious assurance of God's guidance. He had to move on faith, remembering past times of God's faithfulness. As such, this text illustrates ways in which believers are often forced to make important decisions without the benefit of a specific word from God. This isn't to say that God had actually abandoned David in reality or that God ever abandons us in reality. The silence, the absence, was merely how David experienced the situation. It's how he felt, not how things actually were. David wasn't alone. God was with him. That's why later on in his life, David penned what is perhaps one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible, Psalm 23. And in Psalm 23:4, David says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil for you, for God is with me. His rod and his staff, they comfort me. God was with David. But there are moments in life where it feels like God is absent or God is silent. And it's in those seasons, it's in those moments, it's in those circumstances in which we feel so confused or paralyzed when it comes to making important decisions, life-altering decisions. We would love it if God would tell us exactly what it is that he wants us to do when we're faced with sometimes not only one or two choices that we could make, but a myriad of different choices that we could make. But that's simply not how God works. Instead, God desires for us to make decisions for ourselves while trusting that he will guide us along the way. He wants us to submit our entire decision-making process to him in faith as we employ the reason and the logic that he has given to us. I think so much of this conversation hinges on the concept of free will, and I believe theologically, I believe personally, I believe with my whole heart that God has given us a great deal of free will. I believe that God has given us this great deal of free will, this capacity, because he so desires for us to be able to choose whether or not we'll have a relationship with him. Because the fact of the matter is, no relationship is possible without free will. Love extended out of compulsion isn't real love. God could have created us to be completely decision-free, almost like we would be robots that simply would do his bidding and never make free choices, but he didn't do that because God loves us so much that he gave us free choice. As C.S. Lewis once said, free will, though it makes evil possible, it also is the only thing that makes us able to love or experience goodness or joy. A world of automata, of creatures that work like machines, would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other in an ecstasy of love and delight, compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that, love has to be free. See, it was God's desire to give us free will because he wanted us to love him freely, free from control or coercion. And because we have this ability to make free choices, it follows that in any of the decisions that we make in this life, we've often got to decide for ourselves. I think a lot of Christians get tripped up when they suppose that God has already made all of their decisions for them, apart from free will. Decisions like whether or not they'll be saved, or who they'll marry, how many kids they'll have, what career they will have. A lot of people will talk to me about selecting a spouse as though there's one person on this entire planet of 8 billion people that God has selected us to be compatible with. I just don't buy that. I love Krista with all of my heart, but the reality is either one of us, under different circumstances, could have made the choice to be with different people. I think that human existence is open in so many different ways. It isn't that God has made all of our decisions for us, and if we somehow make a wrong choice, we'll end up missing out on God's will. It's that God has created a universe in which there are a lot of potential possibilities. And God wants us to employ the faculties of our free will, reason, and logic to select our own path in life. That's part of the adventure of faith, is going out and making choices for ourselves. But that can be risky. Making decisions always carries with it an inherent risk. And I think that's why here in 1 Samuel 27, we don't just see David using logic and reason. We see him stepping out in faith, in trust in God. God desires for us to also employ faith as we make decisions, remembering not what only he's promised to do for us in the future, but also what he has done for us in the past. We have to trust that he will be with us no matter what decisions we make. As Blaise Pascal, who was a brilliant French philosopher, mathematician, and theologian, I would love to have those credentials, but I'm terrible at maths, and philosophy doesn't quite jive with my mind very well. So theology is the only thing I've got on Blaise Pascal. He was way more smart than I'll ever be, and he said this one time: "Faith certainly tells us what the senses do not, but not the contrary of what they see. Faith is above the senses, but not against them." Going back to mine and Krista's decision whether or not to have kids, we prayed a lot about what the right choice was. We prayed a lot about whether or not God wanted us to be parents. And there were a lot of days where it felt like God was refusing to give us a clear-cut answer. That maybe he was okay with whatever choice we made. He just wanted us to be available and to trust him whichever path we decided to go down. He wanted us to use the resources that were available to us at the time and to freely make that choice. But we weren't alone in that. As I look back in retrospect, I can say with a high degree of confidence that God was with us along the way, particularly during that lunch conversation that we had with that couple. And as I've been thinking about this past week, I think that God helped us make the decision we did. It's not that he forced us into it, but he helped us. I once heard someone say that God writes straight in crooked lines. Makes no sense, does it? God writes straight in crooked lines. But I think that's an excellent way to describe the life of faith, and I want to explain. One writer comments, "Normally, We only see the specific ways in which God has led us as we look back on it after the passage of time. Only then can we trace God's special guidance and do that through very crooked lines, meaning unexpected or even unwarranted events. Yet through all of it, we can see that God has indeed written straight. What he writes well. This writer continues to say, reflecting on the important decisions of life after the fact is easy. Making those decisions at the time, however, and determining the right decision can leave us with the most helpless feeling. In 1 Samuel 27, David presents us with an example of carefully making thoughtful decisions with the best critical faculties we have been given by God, while trusting him to guide us along the way. Here we find the principles of deliberation and consultation before taking decisive action, and these are the steps that God often honors. To be sure, God is never silent. God is never absent. As we get ready to celebrate and to reflect on the meaning of Advent and Christmas here in the next few weeks, we remember that one of the central claims that we proclaim during that season is that Jesus Christ is Emmanuel, God with us. He is in the thick of this life with us. And Jesus is also our good shepherd, the one who is guiding us, leading us, and urging us forward. God's not necessarily making our decisions for us, but he is with us as we go about that process. And I don't know about you, but I find a great deal of confidence in that, because there are going to be complex decisions that we all have to make at some point in the future. We've already made a lot of complex decisions as we sit here in the present. That process might feel confusing at best and absolutely paralyzing at worst, but instead of fretting anxiously over which choice is the right choice, you and I can rest assured knowing that God has given us the capacity to make decisions on our own. And as long as we're talking about a morally good course of action, he will guide us no matter what path or what road we end up going down.